Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library. I know December is a very busy time for everyone, so we are really grateful that you fit us into your calendar during this festive season. Are there any first-time visitors to Mount Vernon? I love seeing a first-time hand, but I'm also thrilled that there are so many returning friends. If you are looking forward to your next return visit to Mount Vernon, might I give you a few suggestions? We have on January 9th a special free lunch at the library with George D. Oberle on his book, Creating an Informed Citizenry, Knowledge and Democracy in the Early American Republic. And our next Ford Evening Book Talk, authors actually here in the audience, not to call them out, will be on January 29th with Alex Zerker-Reithart, author of Roads to Power, Roads to Crisis, The War for the American Interior, and the Infrastructural Routes of Revolution. We want to thank the Ford Motor Company who has supported these popular monthly series. They make it possible for us to make them free for all of you and bring in wonderful scholars to share their work. So we are incredibly grateful to their ongoing support. We also try and include everyone in these conversations. So once we get to the question portion of this evening, you will see a QR code on the screen. If you have never joined us for one of these talks, the QR code works in this way. Pull out your phone, open the camera app, hold it up. It will automatically take you to a website where you can enter in your questions at any point throughout the evening. So you don't have to try and remember your question or write it down. You can just enter it, and then I will get it on my iPad and I will incorporate it either into our conversation or at the very end. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. She will be giving a brief introduction, and then we will have a conversation, and I will include your questions. Dr. Lauren Duval is a historian of early North American women and gender. Her research examines British-occupied cities during the American Revolution through the lens of the household. She is an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma and currently a Gibson Fellow in Democracy at the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. She is here to talk about her new book, The Homefront: Revolutionary Households, Military Occupation, and the Making of American Independence. She has also been a longtime friend, and while this is not important to you all, it is important for me, for you to know that she has a dog named Fonzie, and Fonzie is the only dog that my dog, John Quincy Dog Adams, tolerates. So I am thrilled that she's here. It's been a long time in coming, and she has been a lovely friend for a very long time. So I'm so excited about this evening's event. I'm excited for her to share her work with you, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Duval.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's especially nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. And I want to thank Lindsay and Stephen McLeod, Mount Vernon, the George Washington Library for having me here tonight. It's absolutely thrilling to be with you all here, to be able to talk about my new book. So I want to give some brief comments to provide some context for the conversation that I'll have with Lindsay. And then obviously I'm happy to elaborate on any of this during the question and answer period. So, it is impossible for me to describe to you what I felt when the British Army was on this side of the Ashley Ferry, Mary Lucia Bull wrote from Charleston in 1779 in the midst of the American Revolution. Recounting the terror and the uncertainty that war had introduced into her life, she recalled, quote, "We never went into our beds at night. We had candles constantly burning and were alarmed at every noise we heard." We are accustomed to thinking of the war for American independence as occurring on the battlefield. But most people throughout the colonies experienced the war not on the field of battle, but in their households. The Revolution was, first and foremost, an extended, brutal civil war that was fought in and around civilian communities. And whether by choice or force, inhabitants of all races and genders became embroiled in the military conflict, enduring battles, quartering, troop requisitioning, property destruction, and the threat of bodily harm. And really throughout the colonies, the American Revolution threw people's lives into disarray. And for many people, safety, survival, the protection of their loved ones, the preservation of their property, these ideas far outweighed abstract political principles. And nowhere was this more true than in the 6 cities occupied by the British Army during the war. So during the Revolution, the British Army actually captures and occupies every major city along the mainland Atlantic seaboard. This is Boston, New York, Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. And this is a strategy that was deeply rooted in European warfare, right? By seizing control of ports, the British were able to more easily obtain supplies and reinforcements by sea. They could also use the city as a base to launch excursions into the surrounding region. But these cities were also homes to diverse civilians for whom warfare was a new and terrifying experience. In the decades preceding the Revolution, cities in British North America had been relatively free of military conflict. Although British troops would occasionally lodge in urban barracks, most warfare in the late 18th century is taking place in the contested backcountry. But all of this changes during the Revolution. In and around occupied cities, civilians suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of military conflict. During the 1778 siege of Newport, for instance, Mary Gould Almy ran through the streets with her 6 children as guns resounded above. Men, women, and children, all in a great as consternation as myself, she recalled. The ships fired continually, the women shrieking, the children falling down crying. It will ever be in my remembrance. During the 1779 siege of Savannah, a Continental officer was shocked by the gruesome civilian casualties, including many women and children. They have all got into the cellars, but even there, they do not escape the fury of our bombs, he grieved. Meanwhile, in Savannah's unpaved streets, enslaved children diffused unexploded shells by covering them with sand. And so proximity to army and battles exposed inhabitants throughout the colonies to plunder, to property destruction, assault, other forms of violence. And throughout occupied regions, martial law and urban warfare really upended the customary privileges of rank, requiring civilians to carry passes to move throughout occupied cities, to adhere to curfews, to undergo bodily searches as they crossed military lines, and to endure constant surveillance of their daily activities. And so centering these experiences, the home front shows that the American Revolution is deeply entwined with domestic life. And one of the things that I try to do in my book is to really get inside of revolutionary households in order to view the war from the perspective of those people who lived through it. To place readers in the streets flooded with British troops, in the residences where ordinary people navigated the chaos, violence, and turbulence that the war introduced into their lives. And what I want to do with the remainder of my brief introduction here is give you a few quick examples to illustrate how occupation resonated in these very intimate domains. So revolutionary households were comprised of diverse inhabitants, right? You have white men, women, and children, domestic servants, both black and white, and enslaved people, all of whom had different priorities and divergent responses to the arrival of the British Army in their cities. And occasionally, their aims aligned, but much more frequently, they clashed. And so I think quartering can give us a really good sense of how this works, right? Because we all learned about the Quartering Act in our American history classes. We know it's one of the 4 factors that leads to the revolution. But that in practice, the lived experience that so many people endured during the war is a bit more nuanced. So as examples from throughout occupied cities illustrate, Anglo-American men frequently felt that quartering undermined their property rights. It impeded their ability to govern their households and their dependents. But the very same British officer who routinely quarreled with his civilian landlord over household space may have represented something very different to the other inhabitants. Because of various British emancipatory policies throughout the war, to an enslaved person, the officer may have represented an avenue to freedom for themselves and their kin. For a woman employed as a domestic servant, the officer may have seemed a new potential employer, one who would probably pay higher wages, probably in precious hard coin, could perhaps secure her steady access to food throughout the indeterminate war. Perhaps he was a potential sexual partner, or maybe one of the officer's servants was a prospective husband, all of which she could leverage in an effort to better her circumstances and perhaps leave domestic service altogether. For the householder's unmarried daughter, the officer might be a charming potential suitor, one who was eager to escort her to the many balls that the British Army hosted for young civilian women throughout occupied cities. And for the householder's wife, the officer might appear a chivalrous guest, one who respected her household rules and socialized politely with her friends. Or, alternatively, the officer and his retinue might be disruptive or violent. Their presence might make household inhabitants feel vulnerable, scared for their safety. In this case, perhaps the whole household might unify against his presence and seek to encourage him to change his billet elsewhere by making his life uncomfortable. Or maybe they simply stayed as far away as possible, or any combination of all these things that I've just listed, right? And this is a key point because occupation not only introduced unprecedented violence into civilian life, it also fundamentally, if fleetingly, altered the power dynamics of revolutionary households. Because in cities under British rule, American men were no longer in charge of their households. The British Army was. And this fundamentally upended the lives of everyone who resided within them, for better and for worse. And one of the things that we see happening with this disruption in household governance is that the structures overseeing daily life really loosened, right? For the lives and labors of white women, enslaved people, domestic servants, providing a lot of these people with opportunities and new levels of autonomy to determine the course of their lives. So I'm going to go into a few of these now. So, for instance, in July 1782, in the British Army's New York headquarters, a 26-year-old enslaved woman named Venus seized upon the disruption of occupation to emancipate herself from bondage. 2 days later, her enslaver pasted a notice in the newspaper advertising her escape. It was conventional, as runaway ads go, and sparse on details. But later that week, this extraordinary response appeared in the New York Mercury, or Good General Advertiser. Evidently, Venus had seen Charles Bordwine's advertisement for escape and chose to publish a rebuttal. Written in her voice, this advertisement is remarkable, right? We don't see things like this occurring throughout the early American period. So defending her actions, Venus recounted that she had secured a promise from her enslaver that she could purchase her freedom. She and her husband had worked, quote, very hard to amass that sum. But in July 1782, when the couple handed their 50 pounds over to Charles Bordwine, he flatly refused to free Venus, and neither would he return the couple's money. And so taking to the newspaper, to the very space where slaveholders advertised for fugitives and sold enslaved people as commodities, Venus declared that she had been wronged and endeavored to hold her enslaver accountable for the verbal contract that he had made with her. And the boldness of this approach suggests that Venus had a protector in the occupied city, likely a white person, given the ad's stereotypical mimicry of enslaved vernacular. And in the British Army's North American headquarters, almost certainly this person is an officer. Right? And so seizing this opportunity, Venus asserted publicly and unequivocally that she was not a fugitive, that she had earned her freedom, and that she wanted her money back. And again, throughout occupied cities, we see how the presence of the British Army created conditions that upended the prevailing norms of domestic life, both through military policies and the actions of individual officers that relegated heads of households to subordinate positions within the hierarchies they were accustomed to overseeing. Elsewhere in New York City, for instance, we have another clash emerge between Dr. Daniel Kendrick, a loyalist surgeon in the Army's General Hospital, and he routinely gets into conflict with Lieutenant Thomas Tomlins Pritchard of the 2nd Battalion of New Jersey Volunteers. Both men are living in the same residence. They both believe that they should be in charge, right? Kendrick because of his higher social class, Pritchard because of his military affiliation. And their disagreements regularly devolve into shouting matches. Occasionally, they turn violent. On more than one occasion, the lieutenant threatens to shoot the doctor or run him through with a bayonet. But the two men are routinely sparring with one another over this household space, right? Weaponizing their shared living situation in an effort to manipulate the domestic environment in ways that make the other uncomfortable. So doing things like leaving the door open during the winter months, parading horses through the house, locking one another out of the building, right? But as Lieutenant Pritchard also testifies later, because this ends up at a court-martial, this conflict was also a proxy war that increasingly drew in family members and household laborers into this fray. Dr. Kendrick encouraged his friends and his patients to loiter on the stairs, lobbing insults at the lieutenant whenever he walked by. On another occasion, Mrs. Kendrick brandished her fist at the officer, insulted him with, quote, very bad language, and then encouraged other women to taunt Pritchard's wife. The Kendricks also encouraged impudence among their servants, encouraging them to insult the Pritchards, their servants, and their children. Now, in contrast to this combative household warfare that we see in male-headed households, quartering could look really different in households headed by white women of the upper classes. And I think this is important, right? Because it exposes the range of wartime experiences happening in these cities, but also the vital role of gender to how quartering unfolds in these domestic domains. And here, quartering was often an arrangement of flexible, negotiated cohabitation that facilitated elite white women's ability to retain control of their households and the officers residing within them. So Philadelphia Quaker Elizabeth Drinker, who's up here, she, for instance, interviewed Major James Crammond of the 42nd Regiment 4 times before agreeing to allow him to lodge in her house during the winter of 1777 to 1778. And in these meetings, she negotiated the terms of the billet. She made clear her expectations of the officer's conduct while he lived under her roof. She voiced her disapproval of officers' behavior that she had seen throughout the city. And in response, James Crammond insisted that he was not like those men, that he would refrain from swearing and gambling, that he would keep early hours, and he promised that he would limit his business and his entertaining to his private rooms. And these are rules that he actually largely abides by, right? Which is really different from the vision of quartering we tend to have in the American Revolution. And we know that he abides by these rules, not only because Elizabeth expresses satisfaction with Crammond's behavior, but also because John Peebles, another officer in Crammond's regiment, reported dining with Crammond at the Drinker household in February 1778, and he complained that it was, quote, a showy dinner and not much drink. And so, respecting the boundaries that Elizabeth had created within her household, James Crammond structured this dinner, right, to minimize noise and the vices that she abhorred. And when the meal concluded, the men actually departed the house to go play whist. And so evidently, Crammond also upheld her strictures against gambling. And so Elizabeth Drinker clearly had this situation pretty well in hand, right? But for her exiled husband, Henry, he was far less comfortable with this arrangement, with his family living in a household with a British officer, actually Scottish. Crammond is Scottish. And endeavoring to calm Henry's fears, Elizabeth characterized her interactions with Major Crammond as neighbor's fare, insisting that she avoided the officer whenever possible. But her diary tells us something different. She and James Crammond routinely shared coffee and tea, often joined by various friends and neighbors. On at least one occasion, Crammond accompanied Elizabeth on her visiting rounds. Her friends approved of the officer, she noted in her diary with satisfaction. And after an evening of socializing the Drinker household in early March 1778, Major Crammond actually walked one of Elizabeth's friends home, suggesting that he had become a valued acquaintance and a surrogate protector among her circle of friends. And notably, Elizabeth also became acquainted with some of Crammond's fellow officers, especially those quartered among her friends and neighbors. And knowing that this camaraderie might exacerbate her husband's unease, Henry, after all, had been very explicit in his wishes that the household interact with Crammond as little as possible. Elizabeth downplayed the extent of her interactions with Crammond in her letters to her husband. And I want to be clear, there's no evidence that anything untoward is happening between Elizabeth Drinker and James Crammond, but she was lonely and worried, and she found unexpected companionship with the British officer, and she was unwilling to dissolve that connection simply to appease her absent husband. And so in all of these examples, right, what we can see is how occupation and the presence of British officers upended the norms and the order of domestic life. Throughout the conflict, the household was simultaneously a nexus of emotional ties, financial interests, race and gender relations that grounded the social order, and a place of wartime violence, disruption, and chaos, where people experienced fear and insecurity that had the potential to overturn the very stability that the household was supposed to represent. And it's only by attending to the interplay between these dynamics that we can really fully comprehend the scope of the military conflict and the vital role of domestic life to how people experienced the revolution and understood its consequences for their lives, their families, and the nations. And so to wrap things up, right, the revolution looks really different when viewed from the household. It looks messier, less cohesive, more contradictory. And the view from the home front really clarifies how domestic life and ideas of home were integral to the revolution. And at the war's end, many people wanted nothing more than to be safe at home with their families and secure in their property. The resumption of domestic life free from fear and free from interference, was integral to how many white Americans envisioned their new independence in the new nation. After 8 long years of civil war, a war that invaded their households, disrupted their finances, subjected their families to fear, separation, anxiety, revolutionaries reveled in their hard-won domestic tranquility, secure in the belief that their residences were safe from the invasion and violation of the war years. And in the post-war years, what we see happening throughout the nation is white Americans really celebrating the private home as a national symbol, one that epitomized masculine authority and the sacrifices of war. And there's perhaps no better example of this post-war domestic idealization in the national imaginary than George Washington's vaunted return to Mount Vernon, the American Cincinnatus retiring to sit under his vine and fig tree. And this is because this aligns with many people's personal desires for domestic tranquility. Washington's well-known love of private life, his long-desired homecoming, endowed his beloved Mount Vernon with outsized significance in the new nation. Throughout the country, Americans celebrated Washington's triumphant return, lauding domestic repose as his just reward for his wartime sacrifices. And in the early years of the nation, Washington's private retreat became a public spectacle. Visitors routinely made pilgrimages to Mount Vernon. Images of the plantation circulated in print form and engravings on mass-produced ceramics and clocks. And in purchasing these items, American citizens could bring Mount Vernon into their own households, emulating the general's domestic felicity beneath their own vine and fig trees, where, surrounded by their families, they could, in Washington's words, enjoy without molestation the sweets of peace and domestic happiness. Thank you.
I love this painting because it's all like the adult and then the child version. That's not at all a child. It's like just a mini version. Our friends from C-SPAN are with us, so we are multiple miking today, which is wonderful to have such good. Okay, so we have all the best technology here. And JR, can you switch over to the QR code screen, please, so that we can make sure we have okay, 1 minute. That's excellent. I have lots of questions anyway, so perfect. But think of your questions and be ready to pull up the QR code. So, Lauren, one of the things that I think about your book is so interesting is it combines what was genuinely felt by people with real legal implications and safety implications. And this is often captured under this concept called the castle doctrine. And this is so important to American identity and American history. So can you tell us what is the castle doctrine and how does it kind of underlie all of these concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. So castle doctrine is deeply rooted in Anglo-American jurisprudence, right? And the shorthand is that an Englishman's house is his castle, right? It's this idea, really, that English subjects, right, and this includes Anglo-American colonists at this point, right, that the foundation of their liberties is in the protection of private property, right? Because it allows men to be independent actors, right? It grounds their patriarchal responsibilities to their dependents. It really is kind of central to the liberty that Americans are arguing for in the Revolutionary crisis, right? And as the imperial crisis deepens in the 1760s, 1770s, we hear this as a rallying cry again and again from American revolutionaries that they're pushing back on developments happening in Britain, right? The taxes, things, all the things we know, right, leading up to the revolution. And so it becomes really central to this idea that households should be private spaces protected, right? I think always this is a bit more of an ideal than what happens in practice, right? But it's a very, very powerful legal and ideological boundary that really serves as a rallying cry for American revolutionaries. Now, of course, the war itself fully upends that, right? It becomes very clear that households are not castles. Officers are quartering in the house, warfare is happening nearby, supplies are being requisitioned, right? And so I think the war itself really does a lot to destabilize that notion for people who lived through the war. And I think that's one of the things that we really see happening in the early republic, right, is this kind of massaging, right, of the concept into more this idea of peace and tranquility under their vine and fig trees, right? And I think that also it conveys a lot of the same ideas, but also doesn't have the monarchical metaphor, right, which is very important in the early republic.
Well, and this is particularly important for what became the United States because their standards of house ownership and the frequency with which people had sort of their own dwelling was not like other societies. And it led to this concept of Americans being house proud.
Yes.
So what does that mean?
So house proud is actually a quote from a Hessian officer. He gets to the colonies, he's looking around, and he describes Americans as very house proud, right? And this really is kind of what it sounds like. They take great pride in furnishing their houses, right, and having, particularly in these urban ports, right, because these are nodes of connection to the Atlantic world. These are really the places that were at the center of the 18th century consumer revolution, right? And so people are of the middling upper classes, but also lower classes who can kind of purchase things secondhand, are really going to great lengths to make their living spaces nice, right? They're purchasing nice carpets, mahogany furniture, and tea sets, and porcelain, right? And kind of all of these accoutrements of domestic life that increasingly not only shape the places they live, but are increasingly kind of entangled with their identity, right? This idea that these like beautiful houses are also conveying something about themselves and their place within the British Empire.
Yeah, I love that because it's so much more than just a dwelling space. And I think this is one of the things that is true for Americans across centuries is our space really reflects who we are and how we see ourselves. It's how we pick out our art. It's, do we have memorabilia from our favorite sports team? I mean, it really does. If we think about our own homes and what we choose to have, it does say a lot about who we are. And so I also really enjoy about the way you handle this work is that so often we think of the household as women's space. And so, if you were doing household studies or if you're talking about the household or you're talking about the home, people are traditionally talking about women. And you really push back on that notion. So why is it so important as we understand the revolution and we understand this period of time that we integrate men into this story?
It's a great question, I think, for a few reasons, right? One is because men were involved in household life, right? Men cared deeply for their families, for their property. They were just as concerned as their wives were about the prospect of armies invading their households, right? Living among their family. And that's a really critical part that's kind of lost, right? And there's a lot of great work that's been done, right? Looking at the household within women's history, kind of the spheres of production, right, that drive a lot of the changes happening in the 19th century, and really looking at the work women do there. But I think it's really important to recognize the household is this shared space. Right? It's a familial space, but it's also a place of labor. Right? You have enslaved servants or enslaved people, domestic servants, who are also deeply tethered to the household, right? You have apprentices. And so these households are really more expansive, right, than nuclear family units. And that's also really important when we're talking about men and domestic life, because this idea that a house is a castle, right, or this is really central to this premise that governs daily life, which is that men will rule over their households and those within them. There are these bonds of obligation between patriarchs and their dependents that really structures not only kind of daily life within a household, but grounds the broader social order, right? That you have all of these households that are replicating these relations between kind of going up to the king and his subjects, right? These relations and obligations that are reinforced and reflected in the household. And so looking at households is very much about daily life, about lived experience, about the finances that are happening there, but also it's also kind of look bigger, right? You see how they're reflecting the larger structures of power within colonial society.
Okay, so let's dig into these 6 cities. And you mentioned these are the 6 cities that the British Army and Navy takes over the course of the war. Of course, not all at the same time, but over the course of the war. What are some of the similarities we see? What are some of the differences we see? What sort of is similar across the entire experience, and what is unique to the different to the different cultures that we know existed between, let's say, Boston and Charleston?
I mean, I think the biggest difference, right, is slavery. I mean, certainly there's slavery in all of these cities, but it looks really different in say Boston versus Charleston, right? Charleston has a much larger enslaved population, and so you have different demographics, right, that are kind of shaping these cities. But I think there's a lot more that connects them. Right? All of these cities are really nodes in the British Atlantic. They are centers of trade, of commerce, of fashion, right? And they're home to a lot of the people who will go on to become power players in the early republic. Right? And I think one of the things that kind of looking at all of these cities together shows us that even despite the different demographics or different weather, right, or kind of differences that are shaping day-to-day life in these cities, there are still larger concerns about household, about family, about property that rise to the top again and again and again. And I think this is one of the things that actually really helps connect diverse Americans after the war, right? Because even though someone in Boston is a very different life than someone in Charleston, they can kind of bond over this shared wartime experience of their cities being invaded, their ordering officers, they're kind of being subject to war in this really kind of immersive, traumatic way.
Lauren, I hadn't seen your question when I asked that question, but she basically asked the same thing. So great minds think alike, and I'm glad we are on the same page. What is we talked about the household, but what is the physical impact of the British Army actually in a city? How does it impact the actual space, and what are some of the scars we see afterwards?
So when the British come in, they fully upend these cities. These are thousands of men coming in. They all need places to kind of sleep, right? So they're drilling on public commons. They're typically usurping schools, warehouses, stores, right? Public spaces to house troops. They do also take civilian houses. The way that happens kind of changes throughout the war. But initially, they're trying to comply with the Quartering Act, right, which says that you have to compensate householders for house room. But they really don't want to be putting troops into inhabited houses. Officers are an exception, right, because they are deemed to be better behaved, right, so they can live among the civilians. But usually what's happening is the British come in and they actually do a survey, right, to take stock of like what houses are empty, which houses belong to revolutionaries, which ones might be worth tearing down to get some valuable resources, right? So they will kind of go through that, and that determines the allocation of troops throughout the city. But then these are also military strongholds, right? And that's a really important part of this, because in addition to fortifying troops, they're also trying to make the city an important defensive place, right? So they are often raising orchards and houses in outlying areas to make the area easily surveilled. They might be sinking ships in the harbor so that enemy ships can't come in, right? They are fully restructuring these cities in ways to support British military operations. So much so that sometimes when civilians come back, they can't believe it's the same city because the kind of landscape around it has changed so much. And then on top of that, when officers and troops are, because sometimes they will also put like full regiments in a house, or it's an empty house, they're hard on the house that they live in, right? There's a Boston woman who cannot believe when she looked out her window that the British are out there kind of cutting raw meat on mahogany table, right? She said, what are they doing? And so I think it is really kind of from the big macro, there are now troops everywhere, right? Civilians move about the city, right? There might be patrols stopping them, asking them where they're going, to kind of seeing what's happening in their neighbor's house as troops are living there. It really transforms the rhythm of urban life.
I think that's important because, and especially as we're heading into 2026 and we think of the war on a grand scale, we think of, armies in the field, we think of the big 8-year narrative arc. We don't often think of the minutia of the knife marks in the mahogany table and what that means for the individual. And that's such an important part of the story because while, of course, the armies are essential to actually winning battles, they're a very small portion of the population. And so I love that you bring so much more of the population into the revolutionary story. How, correct me if I'm wrong, but this strikes me as the occupying of the cities is in some ways, as you said, sort of an antiquated European version of fighting war. how does that go for the British?
So, I think in a lot of ways, there are very practical reasons that the British do this, right? They need supplies, they need reinforcements from overseas, and having these ports allows them to do that. But I think once the British get in there, right, I think they are in many ways waging a war for hearts and minds. If the British, they are capturing these cities, they are instituting martial law, but they are ultimately hoping that these civilians, right, that these colonies will be reintegrated into the British Empire, right? So they actually do take steps to defend civilian property, right, to offer protections to civilians, to give them avenues of recourse if they feel that they have been mistreated by troops, right? And so they are trying to structure these cities in ways that will kind of facilitate transition. In some places that goes better than others, right? And part of that's because the army as an institution has this idea, right? But individual soldiers, individual officers, right, and often do regard American civilians as enemies. You also have, kind of aside from official military policy, large numbers of refugees, both loyalists and enslaved people who are often descending upon these occupied cities in search of protection from the British Army, right? And so what that means is that these cities are so overburdened in a lot of ways because you have the troops, you have refugees. Often British officers have their families with them, right? So there are women and children who also are part of the army, servants, enslaved people. And so these cities are just so full. The resources are really scarce, right? And I think a lot of civilians do end up kind of chafing against some of the regulations the British put in place. They kind of eye the troops with suspicion, right? Like they know they're there to instill order, but often they do bring chaos and danger as well.
There are so many good questions here. You guys are knocking it out of the park, so I appreciate that very much. And lots of interesting questions about the lived experience of these types of different people rubbing up against one another. So Paul wants to know if a household could refuse to quarter a British officer.
They could try. And often women were more successful at this than men, right? And some of this has to do with the way that gender in politics operates in early America, right? So men are political actors. They are expected to choose a side, right? And so if British officers come seeking quarters, the male householder says no, that is making a political statement, right? Women are often able to kind of play with gendered defenses, right? If an officer shows up, and Elizabeth Drinker actually does this to great effect several times before she ends up admitting crime into her house. And they'll say, well, my husband is not here, or I have children, and so we're not comfortable having an officer in the household. Do you think you could look somewhere else, right? And this works for a few reasons, right? But one of the most important ones is British officers themselves also have this sense of martial chivalry, like gentlemanliness, that is really integral as kind of their code of military honor. And part of that is taking care of vulnerable women, right? And so they do, in a lot of ways, not all of them, there are definitely some who are very eager to enforce their view on American civilians. But there are many of them who are trying to work with these women, right? And they go look for quarters elsewhere. And that's part of the reason why these negotiations and rules that women lay out for their households end up working so well, right? Because they are kind of speaking this common language of gendered chivalry that both officers and women can use to their advantage.
Well, Amy was actually asking about these notions of chivalry and the officer code of conduct. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was that concept? Where did it come from? And maybe how widespread was it?
Yeah, so it's a big part of kind of the ethos of the British officer corps, right? And it's not just British officers, right? It's deeply rooted in European warfare. It's has its roots in aristocratic medieval ideas, kind of knighthood and kind of masculine chivalry, right? And it is a big part of it is this idea that British officers are kind of fierce on the battlefield, but off they are gentlemen, right? It's two sides of the same coin. And so that really shapes the way that most officers are interacting with female civilians, right? And so we can see this play out again. We're going to circle back to Elizabeth Drinker. But the first time James Cranman comes and asks for quarters there, she kind of puts him off and says, no, my husband's not here. And he kind of tries to flip the script back on her, right? He's like, well, I hear there's going to be a lot of foreign troops quartered in this neighborhood. I think you might need protection, right? And so it kind of becomes this language through which both soldiers and women are kind of dancing around each other, right? As they're trying to figure out what their relationship will be.
So interesting. James wanted to know if religious differences ever resulted in conflict. Was that a part of the tensions, or was there more of a shared religion than we might think?
That's a great question. So it plays out in a few different ways. Okay, so when the British come into a city, they often are taking public buildings for quarters, right? The exception is Anglican churches, right? The Church of England. Those remain churches. But other denominations, those buildings are often taken, whether it's quarters or riding academies, right? For instance, the Quakers in Philadelphia lose their meeting house. So there's that kind of administrative level at which is happening. I think the biggest way that we see religion playing into this is in Philadelphia. So right before the British actually captured the city, it's very clear they're coming, that they are going to occupy Philadelphia. The Continental Congress actually arrests and expels a number of leading Quakers from the city because Quakers are pacifists. And the Continental Congress is worried that to have these leading voices in the city during a British occupation might help bring about reconciliation, right? And so as part of that, they actually remove these leading figures. That's where Henry Drinker is, right? He is one of the Quakers who's exiled from Philadelphia. And it's deeply because Quaker faith, right? That they are pacifists, that they're refusing to take a side in the war.
That's so fascinating. So Ida is asking the question I'm sure is on all of your minds, which is, with quartering, it seems that there would be ample opportunities for spying. Mm-hmm. Is there much evidence that this happened? And if was it ever uncovered? And if so, what were the consequences?
Certainly it happened. It's not something that I found a lot of evidence with. If you're good spies, there shouldn't be too much of a paper trail, right? I think there's certainly opportunities for it, right? In Philadelphia, there's a woman named Lydia Dura, right, who very famously kind of overhears British officers making plans in her house and gets word to Valley Forge. But I think one of the things that is very clear is that women in occupied cities have a greater amount of mobility than men, right? In part because they're not seen as political actors in the same way. And there's also a realization that the British are often limiting the movement and mobility of men, right? They are sometimes imprisoning them, forcing them to sign loyalty oaths in order to move around. And so because of that, a lot of family business actually falls to women, right? So women are having to go around the city, but often a lot of these wealthier families have multiple houses. If one in the city, one out in the country, they're going back and forth. Sometimes they're sending in slave laborers back and forth. But women actually have a lot more mobility to move across military lines where they might traffic intelligence that way. They might also bring intelligence back into the city. And officers do talk about kind of very purposefully sometimes letting women leave as a way to try to gain intelligence. We also see some women try to use this leniency as a way to smuggle goods out of the city. So for instance, in Philadelphia, I love this story. There's a couple of women who actually strap calf skin to be used to make shoes to their abdomen and feigning pregnancy, right, and try to get through the lines that way.
Did it work?
No, they got caught, but they really it was jarring for the soldiers who found them. They're like, oh
no. You raise a really good point. People often ask us, is what evidence is there of Washington being the first spy master? And there is a little bit, but by design, because he was a good spy master, there's not a lot of evidence. So that is a spycraft 101. If you leave a lot of written evidence, you're likely to be hung like Nathan Hale. Okay, so there's a question about, assuming most of the officers were concerned with this chivalric code, some were not, and there was always going to be some wrongdoing or bad behavior. And so Gregory wants to know, were British soldiers subject to civil law enforcement and adjudication during occupation? And I want to amend that and say, if not, what were the bodies that were holding people responsible for bad behavior?
Yeah, so in occupied cities, soldiers, civilians, camp followers are all subject to military justice, right? And so there are avenues for civilians to lodge complaints against officers. there's kind of different levels at which they're resolved. Some of them are handled in the regiment, some make it up to a general court-martial. But typically, I think that the cases that become prosecuted, right, are the ones that are the most kind of heinous, right, or kind of ones where it's easy to see wrongdoing. It allows the British Army to kind of signal to civilians that they are working to protect their interests, right? So we see they're actually really fabulous sources, right? When civilians come complaining about how British troops have plunder pops up a lot. There's a handful of cases about rape, but really these cases where soldiers and civilians clash, because the way that these trials unfold is they're all transcripts, right? So not everyone who is participating in this trial is literate, but you're able to hear the voices of a lot of these people who maybe didn't leave other written records in the context of these court cases. The other place we do see, it's less soldiers who are involved here, but the British do also install civilian governing boards in every city that they occupy, where loyalists can go to get restitution and kind of resolve disputes. Typically, those avenues are not as open to revolutionaries.
Well, you hinted at this with the trial records in particular, but Lisa wanted to know about the primary sources that were available to you spread across these various cities. So how do you uncover, and you shared with us, Elizabeth Drinker's diary as well, what were some of the ways that you pulled out these voices and pulled out these stories?
It's a great question. So basically, I tried to get my hands on everything I could to see what's going on in these cities, right? And so it is things like letters, family letters, diaries, right, that kind of have been these traditional sources that you look at to understand how South hold life. But I think one of the things that has been a real treasure trove is military sources, right? And that's not a body of sources that kind of historians interested in domestic life have typically looked at. But there are all of these examples when civilians have an issue, right? When soldiers mistreat their property, when they have an issue with kind of a soldier in the street, like they go to commanding officers and they make petitions, right? And so actually all over these military sources are women, civilians, kind of making claims against the British. And so that was a really important source. I also look at newspapers. That's an incredible source for also pulling out examples of enslaved people, right, who are seeking to self-emancipate during the war. Getting into the early years of the Republic, you kind of look at the way that occupation is remembered in school books, in art, in novels. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of access these experiences. And I try to look at them all in order to kind of get as inside those households as I can.
Well, I want to transition to talking about what happened afterwards. And there are a lot of different avenues that we can go down. One of them in particular pops up in some of the questions from people that I kind of want to merge. So Gregory wants to know about what do we know about the prevalence of officers marrying women in homes where maybe they were quartered? And then Tim wants to know what happened to women who were perceived as having fraternized with the enemy during the war. So for the women who were not necessarily opposed to occupation or became convinced not to oppose it, what happened to those women and those families and the people that were supportive?
So there certainly officers married American women, right? And it happens not just at the officer level, but also enlisted men often will marry American women from kind of the laboring classes, right? There's kind of the class solidarity, I guess is the word, right? But that, these are, especially if we're looking at kind of younger people, right? They are living in these cities for long periods of time. In a lot of ways, they are kind of getting back to normal life, even as the war is raging around them, right? And there's just lots of opportunities for socialization, right? Whether in households themselves, the British also kind of intentionally, they have balls, they have plays, they are really, it's part of the chivalric, gentlemanly culture, right? Are kind of creating these entertainments where they can display their manners as gentlemen, where they can socialize with the city, so where they can woo young women, right? And that's a very intentional prompt in kind of the way that the British are trying to win back the allegiances of American civilians. And so there are many, many relationships that develop out of the course of that. women get involved for just different reasons, right? Some are loyalists. I think particularly among women who come of age during the revolution, there is a sense that they are kind of missing out on the prime of their life. Or there's one woman who writes, "This war is not to last forever, but it will outlast my youth." Right? And so for a lot of women, I think that it's an opportunity to have some fun, right? To go to a ball with British officers, to dance, and it's an opportunity to kind of take a break from the dreariness of war. And certainly this is very much a privilege of elite women, right? There are many, many women who endure starvation and hardship and violence during the war. But for women of the elite classes, which is who the officers are primarily socializing with, that is kind of a theme that comes up again and again, right? But it is very interesting as well by the end of the war. So there's this episode in Charleston. It happens after the Battle of Yorktown, so it's very clear that the British have lost. And there's only one account of this event, so it's like, I would love to find more. But supposedly 3 enslaved women organized a ball for British officers in Charleston, right? And part of this speaks to the number of enslaved refugees behind British lines, right? The ways that women might have leveraged those relationships with officers for safety, for freedom, but also suggests that maybe white women are not as into socializing with the British anymore, right? Because they know that the revolutionaries are coming back, right? And that they're going to have to reintegrate into society. But it's this fabulous account where these 3 enslaved women organize a ball, and everyone gets dressed up in silks, and they powder their hair, and they have these elaborate dinners. In a lot of ways, it kind of speaks to just how much occupation upends kind of the norms of daily life throughout these cities, right? Kind of in the way that socialization plays into that.
So for the people who were not as willing to participate, or for those that were left behind once the British did leave, what are some of the implications afterwards? What are the physical implications? What are the legal implications? What are the cultural implications? How do we see that the impact of this occupation in the 1780s, 1790s, and moving forward?
So for women who socialize with the troops, I realized I forgot to answer this question. There is sometimes retribution, right, when the troops leave. I am not the first person to write about this, several historians have. But after the British leave Philadelphia, there's actually an Independence Day parade where American revolutionaries parade a woman who is alternately described as a sex worker and Black, right? We don't really know who she is. But parade her through the city, her hair done up elaborately, wearing a silk dress, kind of like the women who attended these events with British officers. It becomes this way to kind of shame, not her in particular, but kind of like all of the women who participated with the British, right? So there is kind of that level. And then I think we also see that the way that the post-war period unfolds really depends on who people are, right? I think a lot of elite Americans, middle Americans are able to somewhat reintegrate back into life, right? That they make nice with their neighbors after the war. There is kind of a collective impetus to move on, right? And I think in a lot of ways, British occupation becomes really central to that narrative, right? Because it allows everyone who was in these occupied cities to kind of talk about how they suffered under the British, right? And to find common cause. But certainly one of the more tragic things that happens during the war is a number of people self-emancipate to British lines in search of freedom. Because the British promise freedom at various points of the war to people who make it to British lines. And a number of these people do leave with the British at the end of the war. They go to Nova Scotia, some go to Sierra Leone, some go to the Caribbean. But there are also a number of people who, for various reasons, are unable to go. Right? The British routinely kind of leave sick people behind, right? And so there are a number of people who find themselves subject to, they thought they would have protection behind British lines, and suddenly find themselves again kind of facing down bondage and slavery. And it's one of the real tragedies as well. As much as this is a moment of opportunity, there are many people who fall short of this moment.
Robin wants to know about the painting on the cover of the book. So they wanted to know what caused you to pick it, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about it.
So I have to give full credit to my editor. She found it. But I think one of the things I love about this painting is that it shows British troops inside the household, right? And it shows the two women on the end and really just evokes the intimacy of quartering, right? So this is, I believe it's a 20th century painting, right? Kind of just an illustrator. But I think it so well conveys a lot of the ideas and topics that I'm trying to get at this book, right? And to kind of really think about what it was like for civilians to have officers coming to their cities, moving into their houses, sitting at the dinner table with them, right? And I think that this image just conveys that incredibly evocatively.
So we are heading into a year of anniversaries where hopefully there will be a lot, I know all of your attention will of course be on the 250th in the history, but hopefully there will be a very broad public attention, and that's a real opportunity. How would you like us to think about the anniversary? How would you like us to think about this story vis-a-vis sort of the regular story that we might know? What should we be thinking about?
I think one of the things that the anniversary does, I was talking with some other historians of women and gender recently, right? And the last time that we had a big kind of national celebration was 1975, right? And the two books that kind of founded the field of women in the American Revolution, the modern field of women in the Revolution, were published in 1980, right? And so just so much of what we know about women's lives, about domestic lives, about kind of the gendered nature of the war was missing, I think, in kind of important ways from the national conversation, I would imagine, that happened then, right? And so I think it's a real opportunity, and this is where I hope a lot of commemorations would go, to really think about what the war meant, not only kind of in the halls of Congress or on battlefields, right? But to really just think about for everyday people, right, who are trying to make it through this life-altering, traumatic experience, that too is like a really critical part of how we narrate the revolution and what it meant, right? That it's not all George Washington crossing the Delaware, as important as that is, right? But that it also happens in these quieter, more mundane moments that had a real impact on people and on the nation that emerged. Because when it comes down to it, people do care deeply about their families and their households and their property. And that's a really important lens on the war that I think is worth contemplating.
Well, because this show is now back on Netflix, to quote the great Jed Bartlett, what's next?
So I am in the very early stages of a new project that's actually emerging from this one that looks at motherhood and pregnancy during the revolution. And so I think a lot of the ways that historians have thought about this is through this concept of Republican motherhood, right? Which kind of says that in the early republic, primarily elite and middling white women navigated their relationship to the state by raising future citizens. Right? And it's very tied up with important ideas about politics and women's civic life. But I think one of the things that came out of this book as I was working on it is there's so many ways in which pregnancy, parenting gets really complicated among ongoing warfare. Right? And things like some women find their midwives are on the other side of the military lines, right? They're facing on the prospect of armies invading their houses and they're heavily pregnant, right? And really trying to center those experiences as a way to think about what the revolution was like for women and also their hopes, right, for their families and the new nation.
Wonderful. Well, as you all know, I will give my regular spiel. We do have Lauren's wonderful book for sale over here. She will be very happy to sign it for you. We so appreciate your support of our bookshop. It is an important part of our retail work and what we do. Please join me in thanking Lauren for being here tonight and for sharing her work with us. Oh, and I hope you all have a very happy holidays wherever you are. I hope you are safe and happy and with your families.